And finally, let's hear from Misha Galperin, President and CEO of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, also a senior advisor to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. Misha, I know you also have a personal connection to this region. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Presidents Zelensky and Herzog, ministers, ambassadors, world leaders, and honored guests. I'm Dr. Misha Galperin, or in Ukrainian, Mikhailo Davidovich Galperin, or in Ivrit, Moshe ben David. I was born and raised in the city called the Pearl of the Black Sea, or in Odessan dialect, Odessa Mama. One of the most Jewish cities in the world, and also one of the most international, cosmopolitan with Greeks, Italians, Turks, Germans, Russians, and Ukrainians, along with Jews being there from its founding back in the 18th century. Not a melting pot, but a gorgeous mosaic. Everyone reaching some level of integration, but also retaining their own identity. Odessa was once the only place in the Russian Tsarist Empire where Jews were actually not just allowed to live, but were enticed to immigrate to. There were never strangers in Odessa, but among its founders and leading citizens. A noted sociologist once wrote that Jews of Odessa are more like the Jews of San Francisco than they're like Jews of Moscow. They always felt they belonged, at least until the pogroms of 1905. I'm also a grandson of Rabbi Moshe Rabinovich of the shtetl of Tamashpal in the Vinnytsia Oblast, halfway between Odessa and Kyiv. He was murdered by the Einsatztruppen along with 400 of his congregants and family on August 4th, 1941, in what has become known as Holocaust by bullets, at the edge of a ravine, much like Babin Yar in Kyiv. My father, who watched the massacre from a mulberry tree and dreamt about it every night for the next 50 years, was the only survivor. In 1957, he married my mother, a descendant of German Reform Jewish engineers, musicians, and physicians, brought to Odessa in the mid-19th century to help build the southern window to Europe. We came to the US as refugees from the Soviet regime in 1976. I'm very proud of the fact that when I was getting my US citizenship in the early 80s, I put Ukraine as my country of origin, way before the Soviet Union fell apart and Ukraine became independent. When I was in Kyiv for the historic Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency of Israel meetings, where I served as deputy to Natan Sharansky, another Ukrainian Jew, I went on a tour with a local guide who told us that the very first written mention of Kyiv was found in a Jewish document. The so-called Kievan letter, discovered by in the famous Cairo Geniza, a cemetery for sacred Jewish documents that became frayed but cannot be destroyed because they contain the name of God. It was discovered by Solomon Schechter, a great Jewish scholar, and it was a letter to the Kievan Jewish community describing the author's efforts to redeem his brother, held at a debtor's jail in Kyiv for taxes he owed. Pidyon Shvuim, redeeming of the captives, is the highest religious duty a Jew has because of our reverence for life and in order to reassure that neither the captive nor his family would suffer torture and other hardships. I'm not entirely sure that it is, in fact, the first written mention of the great city, but it is a testament of how far back our people's history in Ukraine goes back. So the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Jewish state and the Ukrainian state 30 years ago is what only should have been all along. Ukraine was home to extraordinary Jewish figures from Baal Shem Tov to Nachman of Bratslav to the Lubavitcher dynasty to Shalom Aleichem, also born Rabinovich, like my grandfather, and my grandfather's cousin according to family history, though a black sheep in a Hasidic family. to Leon Pinsker, whose Zionist ideas preceded Theodor Herzl's, Jabotinsky, Bialik, Sholem Asch, Ilya Ilf, Isaac Babel, and the great pianists and violinists of Odessa school founded and named after Pinchas Stolarsky. I was thrown out of the school for bad behavior when I was 6 years old, in spite of my mother being a graduate and my grandmother teaching there for many years. And my grandmother's students at the Odessa Conservatory, Emil Gils, Bela Davidovich, David Oistrach, Misha Elman, etc. As one American Jewish joke goes, a cultural exchange between the Soviet Union and the US is when they send us their Jewish violinists from Odessa and we send them our Jewish violinists from Odessa. And now, to have the president of Ukraine being Jewish? Is Buzzy Herzog Ukrainian? No? Polish? Well, nobody's perfect. Seriously, was the Babin Yar site finally getting its due with the revival of Jewish religious and cultural life through synagogues, Jewish community centers, museums, restoration of cemeteries, and a robust and growing business relationship between Ukraine and Israel and Ukraine and the US? Might I be able to reclaim my Ukrainian citizenship in addition to my American one? When leaving the USSR in 1975, we had to pay for the privilege of giving up Soviet citizenship because USSR and Israel, who sent us the invitations to immigrate, had no diplomatic relations. Congratulations to all involved on behalf of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History, where I serve as the CEO, and my colleagues at American and Jewish foundations and NGOs I work with, particularly the co-sponsors of this forum, Combat Anti-Semitism Movement. We're building it as a movement, like the one that led to freedom for Soviet Jewry, the defeat of apartheid in South Africa, the movements that led to the establishment of the Jewish state, as well as the movements that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the color revolutions, and the independence and democratization of Ukraine. May all three allies, Ukraine, Israel, and the United States, continue to build their relationship, and as our sages say, may we go from strength to strength. Or, as I found out when studying at Yeshiva University in New York, in the words of what is a priestly blessing, and I discovered my relationship to the Kohanim by seeing this on the screen. As Mr. Spock of Star Trek used to say, live long and prosper. Thank you.
Dr. Misha Galperin, thanks so much for that. What a personal story you have, and what a beautiful way you've woven it together with your work at the National Museum. Thanks so much for joining the forum.
Thank you for having me.